My goal for this episode was to review The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich August von Hayek. So I read the book. I took notes on the book. I liked the book for the most part, but more on that in a moment. So here's where Providence steps in. I finished reading the book and some of its references last week. On Saturday, I sit down at the computer and start on an outline for the review. On Sunday, I stopped by the library to make some copies. My printer needs some ink. On the way into the library, taped to a bench in the lobby is a flyer that reads, "Why Libertarianism is Wrong." That caught my attention. It was advertising a lecture that was beginning at that very moment, right down the hall from where I was standing. And it was sponsored by the local Democratic Socialist group. So of course, I crashed it. The speaker was a professor of economics at a nearby community college. He was promoting his book, which just so happened to be a rebuttal to The Road to Serfdom. I know, wow. So I listened quietly for an hour while he spewed forth socialist propaganda. And finally, I was rewarded with the blessed question and answer session. Now, I've been in the audience for some political debates and town hall meetings where you write your questions on a tiny slip of paper because they want it short. And if they actually ask your question, they paraphrase it and butcher it so it's not quite so provocative, and your question loses all meaning. But this lecture had maybe a dozen people in the audience, so it was on. I skipped over the fact that his description of libertarian was so far off that he never even mentioned natural laws or non-aggression principle. That wasn't something I was going to be able to bring them to with the Socratic method. And if I start out by flat out telling them they were wrong, I wasn't going to get them to listen to reason and logic when it came to the rest of his rhetoric. I started by asking him to clarify what he meant by positive and negative freedoms and rights. His description had been vague and wordy, speaking of freedom from and freedom to, similar to what you would find on Wikipedia under negative and positive rights. Adrian has negative right to X against Clay if and only if Clay is prohibited from acting upon Adrian in some way regarding X. In contrast, Adrian has positive rights to X against Clay if and only if Clay is obliged to act upon Adrian in some way regarding X. And of course, he added things like positive rights may include other civil rights and political rights, such as police protection of a person and property, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, such as food, housing, public education, employment, national security, military, healthcare, social security, internet access, and a minimum standard of living. These aren't rights. So when it was clear that his clarification wasn't going to get any clearer, I helped him simplify it by pointing out that positive rights require that goods or services be supplied or taken from others, while negative rights prevent goods and services and natural rights from being taken from you. The professor's answer was, well, it's something like that. It's kind of vague. I'm not really an expert on it. Fair enough. Another point he touched on was the concept of power. He talked about how massive corporations like Alphabet, which is Google, and Amazon and JP Morgan get so huge and so rich that they get too powerful, that their power even rivals that of government. So during the Q&A session, I asked him to come back to what he meant when he compared the power of the corporation to the power of government. I mean, government has the power to forcibly take my money with taxes. They can take my freedom by putting me in jail. They can even take my life and call it legal. The professor said, well, monopolies can tax you too in a way. But, I said, we have the choice to take our business elsewhere. We can support the competition or buy local or grow our own or even start our own business. But it's hard to escape a tyrannical government. How far do you have to go to escape taxes? At this, there were murmurs about how not everyone can afford to have their own garden, and one guy in the back commented about how he doesn't know how to build a smartphone. Silly me, I completely forgot that our former president had declared smartphones a basic human right. I was surprised that none of the socialists pointed out about how corporate power can become a greater threat when the company is so big it starts to influence the government. Seems like a good point for a socialist to make. So I said it myself. They really like that. They started talking about all the money the corporations spend on lobbyists and campaign contributions. When they calmed down, I suggested that if you took the power away from the government, it couldn't be wielded and manipulated by corporations. I'm telling you guys, I really think one or two of those socialists started to understand what I was saying. One of the socialists in the back pointed out that these big companies bully the cities into doing what they want. He talked about how Amazon threatened to leave Seattle when the city tried to impose a very reasonable head tax to pay for housing. I'm sure he wanted to add "for the children," but I guess that's just implied at this point. If you don't know about the Seattle head tax, check it out. I pointed out that the companies brought loads of jobs and opportunity and tax money to these cities, and the company continues to supply these things while the city bullies them by raising their taxes, changing zoning, and squeezing them for every dollar until the company says enough and just leaves and takes all those jobs and taxes and tax-paying employees somewhere with a little less greed. Since we were talking about Road to Serfdom, or a rebuttal, or whatever, I was able to offer some of my takeaways. I explained what Hayek meant when he dedicated his book to the socialists of all parties. The professor said, "Oh yeah, I forgot he did that." His point was that no matter what form socialism you're trying for, communism, fascism, Nazism, democratic socialism, you'll inevitably move toward an all-powerful oligarchy or dictatorship or complete economic failure. Basically, the socialists' desire to eliminate the free market means they have to control supply and demand. Some of them actually think they can do this democratically or just control a small portion of the market, like healthcare or housing or higher education, try to control the price of this or that, or provide the goods or services for free or discounted to a select few. The result is that the still free portion of the market has to compensate and will always overcorrect. Then you get higher prices and less quality and crappier services. As a result, more people need or want help with the service, so the remaining market has to overcorrect even more. Small increase in control, large increase in cost. Then more people need help until the only solution people think will fix it is absolute government control. But you can never control everything. Even if you think you can control parts of the market, a majority vote or even a committee can't respond fast enough to keep up with market demand. So eventually, you have to give absolute power to someone. And since that someone would still have to battle what's left of the free market, their jurisdiction would have to get larger and larger. And since every aspect of our lives is affected by the economy, there could be no decision or freedom we could hold on to for ourselves without upsetting socialist control. Anything less than total and absolute control would not be enough. How do you control the price of a pencil? Control the price of lumber and the machines used for logging and the materials used to make the machines used for logging? Control the price of graphite and the machines used for mining and the materials used to make the machines used for mining? Control the price of rubber and the machines used for harvesting and the materials used to make the machines used for harvesting? Control the price of that metal ferrule that holds the eraser on, and the equipment and facilities used for smelting or whatever, and the materials used to make the machines used for metalworking. This goes on and on, but it's not something that can be controlled, not without completely surrendering all liberties. This is not hyperbole. This is not hypothetical. We've seen the effects well-intentioned control has had on our healthcare system since the 60s, on the housing system, and now on the price of higher education. This guy was a tenured professor of economics. It's been said before, but not enough. This guy is teaching your kids. If they've not been given a sound philosophical foundation, if they are not approaching societal issues with sound logic, reason, and skepticism, then they will mistake this authority figure's emotionally motivated rhetoric as truth, and will consider anyone who questions it as an uneducated fool, not worth their time or intellectual consideration. Even though I had fun, it wasn't easy to stick my neck out like that, but it's like Hayek pointed out in his preface. He had every reason not to publish this book, since many of his peers take the opposite view, and it would surely make him an outcast in his own professional community. Nevertheless, he regarded it as a duty he must not evade. He makes it clear that this is a political book, that it's derived from certain ultimate values, but that these values are not determined by his personal interest, but to serve the interest of the great majority, if not the whole of mankind. The very reason he had pursued an education and career in economics was to try and prevent the atrocities he had known in World War I. Now it was happening again with World War II, and he needed to do whatever he could to stop it. It was a pretty good book. I think it does justice to the topics Hayek wanted to address. That is not exactly a glowing recommendation, but hey, I certainly don't consider it a waste of time, and that's something. I actually did agree with that economics professor in a way, and I told him this. I'm not really a big fan of Hayek. But the reason is, I just think he was too willing to concede certain socialist programs in a free market society. There is no substitute for the free market. When the government forgets that and tries to get involved, they create monopolies with subsidies and corporate welfare. They create a dependent class. They create suffering and poverty. And then people want the government to fix it. The only way the government can fix it is back off. And for heaven's sake, stop helping.